I'm the outreach manager at OpenITP. We're a nonprofit that supports the community behind open source anti-surveillance and anti-censorship tools. And among the many things that we do is we help run Techno-Activism Third Mondays. So Techno-Activism Third Mondays is a community-run effort that happens in 21 cities throughout the world simultaneously. And it brings together people that are working either building these tools or using these tools, or people that are interested in learning how to be more private and secure online. So we have speakers every month, and this month our speaker is Gregory Donovan. He is the founder of OpenCUNY. He is also going to be starting at Fordham in the fall, the communications department. And he's also one of the biggest hearts in the space. So I'm really happy to have him. And he's going to be talking about how, as New Yorkers, or anyone in a big city, is surveilled. So please, a warm welcome.
Thank you, Sandy. That was a great introduction. So I'll be presenting on today is this idea of dataveillance and everyday consciousness in the smart city. And the way I organize this presentation is to try to cover just some key concepts, to give some basic definitions about what I'm talking about and what I mean by dataveillance or smart urbanism or everyday consciousness. Then I'll go into some matters of concerns that I as a researcher and scholar have about these concepts. And then I want to conclude by talking about how we can raise consciousness in a so-called smart city where surveillance is seemingly everywhere. I prepared this kind of like a lecture, but please feel free to interrupt me with questions or shouting out. I'm totally happy to make it more conversational. So if I say something that you want to talk about, just please interrupt me. Okay, so to get started, I kind of like to start with this video. Does anyone know what this, to state the obvious, we're looking at Manhattan, you have Brooklyn, you have Jersey, but what is it that seems to be going on here? Anyone? Crime? That's actually a good, it isn't, but it could be in some instances, maybe. Right.
Traffic accidents.
Traffic accidents. So some kind of activity is being monitored within the city, potentially for crime, potentially for an accident or something like that. These are my own movements throughout the city over the span of a year, right? So this is not because I'm using Google Maps. It's not because I'm using any kind of technology where I'm voluntarily giving up my location. It's simply by having a cell phone turned on and in my pocket, right? As your cell phone is on, it's constantly sending a ping out to the local network. Depending on the return of that ping, how fast it comes back, how strong it comes back, that might indicate the level of bars that your cell phone has, right? So it gives you a sense of whether or not you have a strong signal or a weak signal, but it also allows you to be triangulated at any point in time so that there is a general sense of where you are at any point in time. So if I'm standing here in Greenpoint and my cell phone is checking different cell phone towers in this area, eventually it can be triangulated that I am generally in this area. It was discovered by two researchers in 2011, Alastair Allen and Pete Warden, that the iPhone was storing a local version of this common data, right? It was stored on our own iPhones, our own locative data on our own iPhones. That while this data was going through the telecommunication network and potentially being stored by your telecommunication company, while it was potentially being stored by third-party applications or Apple itself, it at least stored a local copy on your iPhone. So these two researchers created the iPhone tracker, which logged into your iPhone through iTunes, accessed this locative data, and mapped it over time on OpenStreetMaps, right? So it was simply the idea that you could visualize at some level the kind of locative data that was being aggregated on you in real time over the course of your everyday existence throughout the year. Now, this is at the local scale. If you zoom out to different levels, you can see me traveling globally for different conferences. Every kind of movement inside the US and outside where my cell phone was turned on was doing this kind of recording, right? So Apple, of course, became very concerned that this sparked sort of a privacy outrage. So who could guess what Apple might have done to address this privacy concern that arose from the creation of the iPhone tracker?
Delete the copy.
Yes, so iPhone released a critical security update that when you installed, deleted the local copy from your phone, right? So the practice itself was not modified in any way. They didn't stop this kind of aggregation. They simply made sure to remove the ability for everyday people to see for themselves at some level the kind of data that was being aggregated on them, right? So a way of designing consent by screening out the possibility of what kind of surveillance you may be entailed or enrolled in. Right, so starting with this kind of idea in mind, I want to cover a few concepts. One is dataveillance, right? And it's simply the a certain kind of surveillance which the Oxford American Dictionary defines as the practice of monitoring the online activity of a person or group from algorithmic study of the residue of their various electronic and digital transactions and activities. And why this is particularly important to think about is that with traditional surveillance, we might think of a closed circuit television, CCTV, where you have a camera actually looking at you, or a physical object that appears to have some sort of technological eye trained on your movements. In this case, though, it's hard to see the surveillance while it's happening because it feeds off of other activities you're doing and aggregating that data without you being aware of this process going on. You don't see this data being aggregated. It's very hard to understand what even an algorithmic study is, never mind what the word itself means. Much of this looks like familiar brands to us, whether it's Gmail, iTunes, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat. If you're not paying a fee for these kinds of proprietary social services, you are almost always certainly paying with your personal data, right? This is their currency. This is how they build capital. And even in cases in which Snapchat, for example, not to pick on them, but even when a social media service sort of bills itself as providing privacy or more anonymity than other services, because your data remains the currency, it's impossible for it to truly protect your privacy, right? So the Electronic Frontier Foundation recently did an evaluation of various media services, rating their levels of interest in protecting users from government surveillance, right? And Snapchat was ranked at the bottom, more or less not caring. And this is because there's no private solution to a public problem, right? So if the problem is that we're losing a sense of privacy because our personal data is being placed under so much surveillance, then creating a for-profit model that's somehow going to fix that when they're still depending on making money off of your private data is not going to solve this problem alone. Something that technically might make you anonymous, but then pulls a profit by selling your data sort of undoes itself. Another kind of form of dataveillance that we often forget about because it doesn't feel digital, it doesn't feel as, I don't know, tracky as social media might feel, would be everything from debit cards and credit cards to loyalty cards, right? All of these tracking your purchases, the kind of purchases you make, where you make them, when you make them in response to potential advertisements that you've seen. There have been contracts signed between Walgreens and Facebook, for example, where depending on the kind of advertisement you might see on Facebook of a particular product, if you show up at a Walgreens down the street within a day and purchase that exact same product, they have some sense of seeing if there's a relationship between the advertisement you're seeing and the purchase you ultimately make. And then, of course, we can think of Target, which has been in the news a lot lately for having been at the forefront of gathering citizen data in order to make more targeted advertising campaigns, right? A particular famous example was of a young woman who started receiving mother-to-be kind of samples and advertised them, but she had not yet told her father that she was pregnant, right? But because Target had been tracking her purchases at the store, had profiled her as a mother-to-be and thus targeted her for a certain kind of advertising. And I think she was 15 or something. I might have the exact age off. So this is another, what's that?
I want to say it was 19, but still she was very, very young.
Okay, young. Either way, Target knew before Dad did, was the moral of that story. So this is another form of kind of common dataveillance that takes place in everyday lives. And then in addition to this kind of commercial social media or financial transactions or the cell phones that we wear in our bodies, there's also, of course, a government element to this. So I'm going to pause for a very short video. Despite how this looks, it was not filmed in the 80s, and it is legit. It's not like make-believe.
The Center for Cyberspace Research presents New Domain, New Warrior. As the growing threats to national security rise within cyberspace, the Air Force has taken the challenge head-on to fly and fight in cyberspace. For the Air Force, flying in cyberspace means cyber domain dominance. Major General John Maluda, Director, Cyberspace Transformation, provided insights into the Air Force's cyber mission.
For the Air Force, and our core mission has always been air and space. A couple years ago, the Secretary and the Chief put in our mission statement the term cyberspace. The Air Force Institute of Technology is well on its way to making that happen.
With a growing team of 18 faculty members and additional staff, the Air Force Institute of Technology Center for Cyberspace Research is helping the Air Force carry out their newly established cyber mission.
Okay, so one, I want to note that this was made just a few years ago by the Defense Department, which has a larger budget than any other division of government or a Hollywood production company. So it's worth noting just at that level. Two, what that was is that was a recruitment video put on the Air Force's website. It's since been deleted. Originally, the Air Force had claimed that cyberspace was part of its domain. So it was meant to police air, space, and cyberspace. And it started taking on this role of sort of global dataveillance, how to monitor and assess what our enemies abroad were doing. This would not be domestic. It would be kind of abroad focused. At the time, though, a turf war sort of broke out between the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Marines. They all wanted to get in on cyberspace as well. So the previous video doesn't exist, nor does this Air Force specific focus, because we've since established the United States Cyber Command, which is a central operations center for all of the kind of cyber technology and cyber warfare activity going on across the various branches of the military. Yes. And for like the geeks in the room, of which there's probably everyone, you'll see that there is a Linux code ingrained in the emblem, which if you decode it actually gives you a very cryptic mission statement for the whole thing, which is great. And of course, now I bring this up again because it's a common form of dataveillance that we have poured enormous sums of federal money into developing under the premise that this does not violate any laws because it is not focused on domestic activity, right? Now, of course, since then, because of the leaks of Edward Snowden, we're more familiar with the Prism technology, which is a lot of this same kind of government activity, but happening for a domestic purpose. So tools and technologies that were developed for dataveillance abroad are increasingly being focused domestically, particularly in cities in the United States. Any questions so far before I keep going?
One, I think the first thing you mentioned was that Apple is capturing my steps, basically, when I carry my eye-hole around. And I'm wondering if the motivation behind tracking the users of this technology is directly paid for by the Defense Department, or is it kind of paid for through other services just by overcharging it better?
Any phone is going to have to track you.
Right.
Because you have to be able to receive phone calls.
And the cell phone company has to be able to build it.
Well, I'm just asking why are they tracking it, and obviously they do it the same.
So I would say it's kind of all of the above. So the first thing is it's just part of the architecture of the system that they need to track you at a certain level in order to figure out the strength of your signal, where you are, if you're in the network. That's purely for kind of technical purposes. It's not just to spy on you, right? But once a company has that data and can now monetize that information, it creates a financial incentive to do more than what is just technically necessary with that information, right? So what in that case, anyways, what might have been developed for purely technical purposes to facilitate a certain action now is being used for far more than just that. In other cases, we have absolutely unleashed certain funds to specifically create certain programs and practices and activities to conduct surveillance or dataveillance, but under the premise that it would not be on domestic citizens, that this would be for abroad to maintain, to fight the war on terror or the war on drugs or any of these other wars that require intense levels of surveillance for bad guys.
The reason I wanted to ask you this specific question is because Apple is one of the biggest defense contractors in the business. So I'm just curious if they get paid a direct amount of money for selling this to them.
Right, in terms of direct, I do know that the Patriot Act sort of led to the creation of these menus that different companies who have data, they don't just have to turn it over to the government, they have to be paid for it. So if I'm the government and you're Apple and I want one of your consumers' pieces of data, there is a price that is fixed to which you can charge me for turning that over. You have to comply, but you also get paid in the process. That's one aspect.
Sorry, Greg, can I just,
Yeah.
There's another kind of concept that comes out of this that people talk about a lot. It's called a function creep. So
Yes.
if initially we're looking at, you know, an infrastructure topology of a phone being triangulated in order to communicate with the rest of the network, so your location needs to be known and so on.
Yeah.
What had just been a regular inherent part of the system, all of a sudden that data starts creeping into other functions. So it becomes tracking ability for, you know, civil cases, litigation cases, you know, claiming overtime on the job. Well, your phone, according to your records, you were actually here.
Right.
So that's part of the point also. We don't necessarily have to see essentially backdoor payments going on to facilitate this. The data's there. People know it's there. Everybody from the government to lawyers will chase that data if they know it's there.
Right, and this is kind of a common argument with net neutrality, that as net neutrality has been struck down, it creates a financial incentive to further police and monitor the kind of data that flows through a telecommunication wire in order to charge different levels for it. So the ability to charge different people for their data streams creates an incentive to do even more surveillance than what might be technically necessary for linking someone up to a system. So I'll come back to a lot of these concepts, but this is kind of the landscape of dataveillance that I wanted to cover before moving on. The second thing is this idea of smart cities or smart urbanism, right? And smart here is used much like smartphone, okay? Rob Kitchen writes that the idea of smart urbanism should be understood in two specific ways. One, cities that on the one hand are increasingly composed of and monitored by pervasive and ubiquitous computing. And on the other, whose economy and governance is being driven by innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship enacted by smart people, right? And he's not necessarily saying, nor am I, that these people are the smartest ones in the room, or that this really is entrepreneurial or creative or innovative, but that this is the discourse of smart urbanism that so often is promoted. That it's not just a city itself that is embedded with ubiquitous surveillance technologies that will help us plan better cities and organize better cities, but that the people that will be sought to move into these cities and work in these cities are so-called smart people, what Richard Florida might call the creative class, and that the cities themselves should have economies dependent on these new tech startups, right? This is kind of the twofold idea of smart cities. They took on particular prominence in, I think, 2009 as a result of the stimulus package, right? Prior to the stimulus package, this had been starting because a lot of cities and towns were getting Patriot Act funds, right? Department of Homeland Security funds that allowed them to spend more money on security technology domestically and locally. Now, after the stimulus package, if you are IBM, Siemens, or Cisco, and large corporations are starting to slow down on their subscriptions and renewal fees because the economy is contracting, cities and towns that are getting this huge influx of cash now become desirable customers, right? So if you're IBM, Siemens, Cisco, or some of these other large companies, cities and towns become new customers to you, right? And in very banal ways, this can be seen with things like EasyPass, right? A privatized system that allows a city or a town to monitor who is driving in and out of the city and charging tolls for bridges and everything else. Also sensors that are increasingly being embedded for parking so that you can install an application and figure out where you want to park or not. Now, both of these really do raise that issue of function creep. For the purposes that I just outlined, I'm totally in favor of these two kinds of technologies. Enormously useful, very helpful, but what else you could potentially do once you start setting up, for example, a Wi-Fi network or an RFID network that can only be used by certain people for certain purposes and is fairly unregulated. You can also see drones, a technology that was developed abroad, particularly to police borders like between Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iraq and areas like that, you now see coming home domestically. So the NYPD is beginning a new fleet of drones that will fly in the sky, but also Amazon Prime themselves want to offer drones as a way of delivering various goods. Both of these perform a certain kind of urban infrastructure that's becoming increasingly common. And for those of you who may have recently read, Facebook purchased a drone developer because the idea is that solar-powered drones that can stay in circulation for more than a year can become a new way to provide Wi-Fi. Right? So you could actually build a wireless infrastructure that globally circulates through drones that are owned by a private corporation. Then you come to, and IBM is by no means the only one, but one I think is pretty important to focus on because what they've done in Rio de Janeiro. So IBM partnered with Rio de Janeiro in order to create their sort of smart city platform. They're supposed to tie in various data services that are available to the city, all of these different sectors of life, and put it under one proprietary platform. These are graphics from their website. I couldn't make anything remotely this good myself, and they have great videos there too. And if you see some of these videos, you'll see that this is kind of the center in Rio de Janeiro, pulling together all of their data, and it looks like a cross between like NASA and some kind of military expedition, right? This is, again, kind of foreign global surveillance technology coming home and being produced domestically in our cities and sold as a product by a private company. And then kind of a third component of the smart city, not just the kind of technology being embedded, but as I mentioned, the kinds of economies and the kinds of people that are being attracted to these cities. So two most notable examples would be Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley. These are just kind of crude examples of all the various tech companies located in these very, very small geographical regions that have been carved out. I mean, we are literally like right here. In cities, and that this touches on a long history of urban privatization and gentrification, right? So these pictures are from some of the protests that have been going on with the private transportation system that Google has set up in San Francisco, right? To get employees from the city to the campus. And you see people stopping the buses saying, warning, illegal use of public infrastructure. Right? Or gentrification and eviction technologies. That this is a way of laying claim to urban space that has more or less been, that since the 70s during white flight, capital has left a lot of these neighborhoods, but because of their strategic location within these new smart cities, new value is realized. People are moved out, new classes of people come in to work at these new companies and to produce these new technologies for this quote unquote new idea of a smart city. The third concept, before I try to pull these three things together that I want to talk about, is that what runs through all of this is a proprietary bend, right? So I try to think of these as proprietary ecologies, multi-dimensional systems of privately owned data with and within which daily life increasingly takes place. It's meant to take an ecological approach that bridges a technical understanding of information systems that interact at various scales, with a spatial understanding of the social and material relations of production at various scales. So it's information ecology and political ecology, right? And what I mean by this is that not only are public spaces and public services being privatized, but we're also increasingly seeing daily information being aggregated and privatized through intellectual properties as well. This is historically continuous. This is not a new thing. This is not a surprise. This is entirely continuous with urban development, that media has been developed in this way. And I think it's important to take note of, just today actually, David Harvey published a review of Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. And he says his big critique was that capital is a process, not a thing. It is a process of circulation in which money is used to make more money often, but not exclusively through the exploitation of labor power. He then says, the creation of such artificial scarcity is not only what the oil companies do to ensure their high rate of return, it is what all capital does when given the chance, right? So in a supposed post-scarce world where everything is digital, where we can just reproduce something by hitting copy and paste with no added expense, how do you create a sense of scarcity so as to drive up value of certain pieces of information? Right? And so we see not only gated communities, but gated social networks where it's not just about generating data and tracking data, but making sure that a particular company owns it so that other people cannot, right? Facebook does not create social network, it inserts itself into existing social networks so that the kind of community communication that went on prior continues, but now in a proprietary platform. So matters of concern that I think this raises is that our everyday digital engagements increasingly double as research relationships. Research is being conducted. And these research relationships are often hard to see. The sheer volume of all of these services, all of which have a particular function that you may be okay with, that you may totally support, but when added up, it becomes very difficult to actually see through any of this or see any of it as particularly unique or important. This is less threatening than a camera being pointed at you in your bedroom, right? So how do we see these research relationships? How do we foster activities so that people are more conscious of the research relationships they're entailed in through their digital engagements? One way is to think about research as an everyday practice, right? So Aruna Padarai wrote that he argued for a right to research. And he said, by this I mean the right to the tools through which any citizen can systematically increase that stock of knowledge with which they consider most vital to their survival as human beings and to their claims as citizens. So if you want to think about the kind of surveillance going on every day, rather than just saying whether or not it should be happening, we might also want to ask who should and should not be allowed to do it. Right? If everyday citizens had the ability to use this technology for their own ends and for their own purposes instead of just a select group of companies and corporations, companies and governments, then there may be a different power balance that can come from this. Another thing I'm particularly interested in is how the world is increasingly urban and also very, very young. Right? So currently 1 in 2 people in the world lives in a city, and in only about 35 years, 2 out of 3 will. Right? And currently the global population, 43% of it is under the age of 25, right? So the world is young and very urban. At the same time, particularly in Western countries, this is in the US, the kind of communication that people under 25 is doing is very different, right? If you look at this graph from 2011 from Nielsen showing the number of text messages sent per month, right? So for people 13 to 17, it's over 3,000. For people over 65, it's around 64 text messages, right? If you are making voice phone calls, it is much harder to tap your call and get that information, right? We went through this with Nixon where we made it illegal to physically tap a wire without a warrant. So without a warrant, a lot of your communication, if you're over 65, is probably going to be okay. If you're communicating in this domain, where almost everything is digital, there are very few protections on the book to prevent those communications from being sucked up into mass surveillance.
Sorry, to clarify.
Yeah.
This graph shows SMS messages in particular?
Yes.
And it doesn't cover email? Or
doesn't. That's like another, this is just in terms of text, right? So if I were to show you the same study on terms of how much phone time they use, it'd be the complete opposite, right? So just looking at one particular practice, you see a huge escalation in text messaging and a huge drop in phone calls among friends, right? And so even though at one level that might be the same kind of social communication going on, because it's happening in this text message way, it is not regulated by the same kind of laws that we have on the books for phone calls or landline phone calls, because nothing physically, no wire has to be physically tapped to get this information. So it's not a wiretap. Right? We didn't update any of the language. Year after year, we update language for intellectual property, but nothing for privacy. So we intentionally leave certain things behind when talking about how privacy laws should or shouldn't be evolving. And this creates an interesting dialectic where you have youth held up as an ideal, kind of these perfect, precious things that either need to be protected through more surveillance, or you have this idea of youth who are criminals that need to be kind of persecuted with more surveillance or through more surveillance. And I use this particular example not to further shame Brianna Lahara. I think it's actually horrible what happened to her. But because it is such an important example where when the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America, decided to sue people for file sharing, one of the first people they went after was 12-year-old Brianna Lahara, who was a New York City honor student and who lived in public housing on the Upper West Side. Right? And because she was sharing music with friends online, she not only had to pay a $2,000 fine, but she had to issue a public apology for her file sharing. Right? And this was not only to kind of, punish Brianna, but to strike fear in other children, as well as parents and guardians who didn't want this happening to their kids.
It's worth noting that that was part of the campaign. There was something on the order of 20 what are your 30,000 students? And I know one of them as well who actually was basically pushed out of college by the foreign chief.
Totally, there were many thousands of them, and what the RIA claims that they never looked at an individual record, they just kind of batched it because they were trying to claim maybe if we actually knew her details, we wouldn't have hit her, but these other kids would have been fine. I mean, it was many, many cases, and they were specifically targeted to send a message, kind of, because there's no way you can actually police all of the people who file share when about as many people file share as jaywalk. Right? And you don't ticket every person that jaywalks. In fact, there's a very interesting racial history of who you do ticket that jaywalks, right? And this kind of gets into this, that if you start selectively prosecuting certain laws and certain people, then you have 12-year-old girls from New York City issuing public apologies for sharing music, whereas you have bankers who take down an entire economy that admit no wrongdoing, right? There's a huge lopsided aspect there. Yes, great, we're off to a good start. Okay, so this brings us to this kind of final thing that I want to talk about with everyday consciousness, and seeing that anti-surveillance practices are consciousness-raising activities, right? At one level, anti-surveillance practices like cryptography might actually enhance your privacy, it might enhance your anonymity, it might prevent you from falling under certain kinds of surveillance or dataveillance. That's true, and I don't want to minimize that at any level. But I think a secondary consideration we should have is the way simply participating in this, even when it doesn't work, helps raise consciousness about the kind of surveillance that you are under or the kind of dataveillance that you are placed under. The everyday was first talked, well, at least in my mind, first talked about by Henri Lefebvre as the platform upon which the bureaucratic society of controlled consumerism is erected. Right? And he wrote that in 1987, but how he uses platform and what we might think of as Facebook is totally inseparable. And consciousness becomes an important turning point here, particularly if we think about Supreme Court cases like United States versus Jones. Right? So this was a recent Supreme Court case where the justices ruled that a person, that a local department that had placed a tracker on an accused drug dealer's car, that this was illegal. That this violated his constitutional protections because a tracker was physically placed on his car without a warrant. Right? So it violated his reasonable expectation of privacy. And while all the justices agreed that this was unconstitutional, the majority opinion claimed that had this not been physically placed on the car, it would have been constitutional. Right? So yes, the police cannot physically drop a tracker on your car without a warrant, but yes, if you have a GPS unit, they can pick up that feed, no questions asked, no warrant necessary. The majority of the justices agree that that would be constitutional. Sonia Sotomayor was the one justice who agreed with the general case that this shouldn't be legal, but also said this should not be legal either. Right? And in her kind of dissenting consent, she made this point: it may be necessary to reconsider the premise that an individual has no reasonable expectation of privacy and information voluntarily disclosed to third parties. This approach is ill-suited to the digital age in which people reveal a great deal of information about themselves to third parties in the course of carrying out mundane tasks. Basically, she's asking the question of whether we can reasonably consider citizens to consent to this kind of surveillance, particularly by third parties, when that is not what most people realize they are doing. Right? With this in mind, and I'm going to go through this in an even shorter period. With this in mind, I did a research project called mydigitalfootprint.org. And while it did many things, the one thing it really focused on were gaps of knowledge in young people's everyday life, right? Particularly as it related to digital technologies. So I interviewed a bunch of teenagers, 14 to 19 years old here in New York City, and asked them, how does the internet work? How does cyberspace work? How do they think the tool, the space that they're interacting with every day, how this actually works? And while this was incredibly detailed, they knew the name of the computer, they knew the hardware they were interacting with, they knew the services they were interacting with, but the space in between that was this fantastical space of unicorns and clouds and rainbows, right? So this highly scientific chart really does come out of a lot of interviews that I did with teenagers where this was unknown to them, and they were genuinely concerned about that. Usually when I ask this question, how does the internet work? Or when you send an email, how do you think it gets from point A to point B? Their response would be, wow, I've never thought of that before, and now I'm kind of concerned that I don't know. Right? So this was one thing that we tried to focus on: how do we fill these gaps in knowledge? So one thing we did is we built an open source social network together, right? And the goal was not to create another Facebook or to create something that would even be wildly popular or make us any money. It was simply to take the classic consumer of social networks and put them in the role of producer to see what that changes, how this changes their ideas of privacy, property, and security, particularly what it does to their consciousness. So when they were on the production side of social profiles and realizing that these are basically surveys that we're asking people to fill out, that we frame the questions and the kind of responses they can give. If you ask for someone's gender, you could give them 2 options. You could do this weird thing that Facebook has done with 65, or you could just do fill in the blank. And people just fill in what they think their gender is, instead of having to select from a drop-down menu, that these are ethical and moral choices that we're enrolled in, and that the answers that are given become data we can see on the back end of this site. It also raised questions of consent that I got to earlier, which, because this was university research, it meant that the research had to be approved by the Institutional Review Board. So a university entity had to look at all the research we were doing, the network we were about to produce, and say that this was ethical, no one would be harmed in the process, and that we were being transparent, right? Part of that is that we had to create a consent form that was no longer than a page, could be read by a 7th grader, and that clearly articulated what we were doing with people's information and data, how they could get out of the system, how they could delete their account, and who they could get in touch with for more information about their rights. Okay? So not only did we do this, I did this with 5 teenagers who worked with me to build this social network, but as they realized they could create a terms of use policy, it prompted them to ask, why is it we have to write a 1-page consent form when Facebook can create a 50-page consent form that's written in legalese, right? You can see this is Facebook and this is our consent form, right? Just not highly scientific again, but this sort of comparison between the two. And a study was done by McDonald and Cranner in 2008 showing that if you actually added up all of the terms of use policies the average person consents to, that you would lose something of about $781 billion from the opportunity cost value of the time to read those privacy policies. We cannot meaningfully consent to these things. That's how they're designed. That's why they are this way. It's to protect the company or the corporation or the government from any kind of liability, to limit their liability. It is not to actually foster consent or ethical agreement with what sort of research and surveillance you're becoming entailed in. Right, so this is what makes this kind of thing so hard to see if you're an iPhone or any other kind of smartphone user. The production gets kind of masked. You might be using your iPhone here in the East Coast. It's probably being produced under exploited conditions in China. I have an iPhone, so I'm not trying to shame anyone. I'm just saying this is the reality. And then the data itself is increasingly being stored in places like Bluffdale, Utah, right, where the NSA has built a 1 million square foot data center to hold and to host much of the nation's data, and it'll require about 1.7 million gallons of water a day just to keep it cool. So there's enormous environmental impact to all of this weightless data. And again, where it's produced, right, under these kinds of conditions, where it's stored and the ramifications of what you're doing are totally divorced from when you're actually using it. Right? So you are left partially unconscious of the research relationship you're participating in, where the production that brought it to you is geographically removed, and the accumulation and results of it is also geographically removed from your everyday environment, which allows for these absurd words like clouds to be used to refer to things that look like this. Right? Suggests no materiality. Okay, so to really, I'm going to move quick. So what we want to think about is how all of these things, whether it be a program like Tor, or whether it be Techno-Activism Third Monday, or crypto parties, or hackathons, whatever aim these particular programs or practices may have, the sheer fact that they're bringing people together and trying to understand surveillance happening in their everyday life is important to fostering broader public debate and information about what is going on in society. So in closing, I want to kind of close with one example, and it's with New Orleans, another pick-me-upper, right? So this is New Orleans after Katrina, right? Completely devastated. One of the things that was most devastating was their telecommunication infrastructure. Obviously, it's hard for wires to survive something like this. What New Orleans did have downtown, because there was a law on the books in the state that banned municipal Wi-Fi, right? So if a company is not privately offering it as a service, it cannot be offered for free by the government, right? That is a law on the books in Louisiana. But you can have a mesh Wi-Fi network for policing and surveillance purposes, right? So there was a mesh Wi-Fi network set up in this area because CCTV cameras have IP addresses and routinely relay that information via Wi-Fi. So the surveillance network became kind of the core of the emergency personnel network that grew after Hurricane Katrina because a state of emergency had been declared, which meant they didn't have to comply with that law banning municipal Wi-Fi from being set up. So a very large and robust municipal Wi-Fi system. It still was capped. They made sure to cap it so that it wouldn't actually detract any business or take away business from what was at the time Bell South, now AT&T. But although they built up this public municipal Wi-Fi, it played an essential role in emergency personnel coordinating as well as attracting new businesses and people back to the area after it. When the state of emergency was lifted, Bell South started lobbying so aggressively to get them to drop this public system, right? So one of the things they were supposed to do is that Bell South was supposed to donate a building to the local police department to help them reorganize. They rescinded that offer once municipal Wi-Fi went up. They said, if the city is going to challenge us in this way, we're not going to donate a building to help organize the police department, so you're on your own. And they continued to kind of lobby the city until what happened was that the public municipal Wi-Fi was sold off to a private contractor. Right? So it is now no longer public infrastructure, it is no longer public utility, it was a public service that was effectively privatized and existed in part only because of the ability to conduct surveillance and policing on a population, which leaves us with this question, who gets to produce knowledge in the smart city, where and for what purposes? Right? If we can do these kinds of Wi-Fi networks for surveillance and for security, why not for different kinds of civic engagement or community empowerment projects? That is it.
What did the students think about the different privacy policies and
yeah, so interestingly, their reaction was not like drop out, right? It wasn't so much, their reaction was, it was a bit of anger, I guess, right? They were really frustrated that if 5 teenagers and myself could figure out a way in one page to create a terms of use policy, then why couldn't Facebook with all these lawyers do it? And so it got them a little angry, and I think it communicated a sense of intentionality to them, that these weren't people that were trying to explain it to them under any circumstance, that they were intentionally being misled. We got into similar kind of debates where when we had to set up our own privacy management tools, right? It became aware to them only when we created one that Facebook doesn't give you the option to prevent Facebook from seeing something, right? You can have hundreds and hundreds of features to control how other people see you on Facebook, but nothing controls what Facebook sees. So that tended to be what they kept coming back to, a bit of anger, but a bit of kind of realizing there was some intentionality here that could be addressed by, if 5 teenagers could do it, a company theoretically could do this as well.
So one of the concerns about reasonable expectation of privacy is that users don't understand that they're being tracked in this way. So I'm wondering how you approach the concern about, by raising consciousness, you're actually creating people's understanding that they are being tracked, and therefore they have no expectation of privacy because they understand.
Right, so absolutely, and this is why I think the most dangerous thing to have come out of the Snowden leaks, right, is that people say, we have no privacy, get over it. Because that actually does lend itself to creating a new kind of public norm about what level of privacy is and isn't okay. So yeah, there's a real danger there that actually raising consciousness and making people aware could actually say, well, you should have known. But what I would say is I think if people really were fully aware, they wouldn't be so accepting of all of these 50-page terms of use policies. We actually might be able to get some legislation moved. If you're a politician right now and you try to take some stand, right? I mean, a totally mild approach was done by John Kerry and John McCain, right? I mean, both are fairly middle of the road. I wouldn't call either like hard right and certainly not hard left, right? So you have John Kerry and John McCain, former presidential candidates. They proposed a piece of legislation that would have added an icon to online advertisements that track your location. That's all it was. It would just simply show an icon to say, this ad is or is not tracking your location, and they couldn't even get that bill out of committee. right? Because if you vote on that bill, no one in the public has any idea you did something in their interest at all. It's not on their radar. Whereas the people who are paying attention have billions of dollars to spend against you in your next election. So even though we might run this risk of making people aware of the fact they don't have as much privacy, I think the upside is that it makes people actually aware of the fact that something could or should be done about this. But it is tricky.
I think your question hit it on the head, and your presentation hit it on the head. There's this, I mean, I've known since they invented the eye hole, as I like to call it, that you carry this around and you basically have, you're basically voluntarily relinquishing your right to privacy. And I think it's pretty conscious to anybody who is conscious that this is going on. And however, the culture within which we live kind of discourages us from actually questioning this. I mean, I don't think it's so much that the technology is news that much, but everything else going on around us is telling us this. And I believe, did you just mention that this issue of, well, one thing that came up when a lot of the revelations were, I would have to say, reiterated through Snowden, because this stuff came out in 2006, and I knew 30 years ago they're checking all the overseas calls. Is that one cliche that came up is like, if you didn't do anything wrong, you know, don't worry about it. Well, that's been the lie has been put to this concept as well, because in the words of one attorney who defended one of the PayPal 14 out in California, is if the government throws 7 different agencies at you and just checks every piece of information, you will find there is no one in the world who is not guilty of doing something wrong. There's enough laws that you're always guilty of something, regardless of how naive and honest you are.
Right. I mean, I agree with most of that. The one thing I would try to distinguish between, though, right, is it's one thing to know that it's being produced under exploited conditions, and it's one thing to know that it might be stored and mined somewhere. But if you're never physically seeing and having to deal with that, that is a different kind of consciousness, right? The idea that we can geographically distribute the production in this way means knowing in an intellectual capacity is one thing, but never having to deal with that is another thing, right? Getting your meat from someone else who butchers it versus butchering it yourself is 2 very different things, right? So I think thinking about almost fast technology like fast food, that if you really slow it down and look at it, it creates a different kind of consciousness. Even though, yes, people are aware often of the kind of surveillance, I wouldn't necessarily say they're fully conscious of what's going on. Gus, I saw your hand. I don't know if you have a question.
Can I actually interrupt and ask that you guys maybe go see you in person? Because I want to kind of make sure there's enough space to socialize and finish the many beer bottles that I bought. So a big round of applause. Thank you. You're awesome.